So evolution of plants and insects. I must say right at the beginning that I am an amateur, enthusiastic, but amateur botanist and entomologist. That's just to protect me against any very difficult questions I might get, because I have a feeling there's one or two people in the audience who are ever so much more experienced than me. And you'll notice it says plants and insects, not bees. The reason for that is that I do think that beekeepers sometimes are a little bit too narrow and forget that insects are such a big group and how important they are. But nevertheless, both plants and insects have evolved together over millions of years. And in that time, they have adapted so that the insect can obtain its food and the plant is pollinated. So some of these adaptations are really complex and ingenious. Engels, emphasizing the importance of insects, points out that more than half of all known species on the planet are insects. They rule virtually all terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems. Many of the insect lineages are ubiquitous, and that includes bees, and they impact our daily lives in a huge way. So they are a very, very important group of animals. And we're going to look at their evolution. Now, these Triassic, Permian, Carboniferous, Devonian, these are periods, not eras. Eras are a larger group that, for simplicity, I've kept it to this. Now, these figures here are amazingly approximate. And almost every paper, every book you look at will have a different time. But broadly speaking, I checked again recently, the figures I've got here are very crudely in agreement with most of them, but they do vary quite a lot because we're talking about such a long time that there will be variations. And going right back to the Devonian, this is when these were the plants around at that time, and these the animals. And we move up as we go through, from fish to amphibians to reptiles to mammals, and similarly with the plants to more complex plants. So early on, we have non-flowering plants, and you'll all be familiar with ferns and mosses, quite different from the higher flowering plants. And they, of course, didn't need pollinators. They didn't grow up with insects, and they didn't really need them. But the early insects, we only know, obviously, from fossils. And fossil insects are very difficult to find because they're so tiny. They are made of chitin, so the chitin allows them to be preserved. But of course, because they're so tiny, it's not like a bit of a dinosaur. Very, very few are found generally, and very few from before the Carboniferous period. A handful, but not many. And those very early ones had no wings and appear to be fairly closely related to the current silverfish. And they were probably food for, as we move through into the Carboniferous, amphibians, scorpions, eventually reptiles and spiders. So they were a very good food source. And because they couldn't fly, they couldn't get away. Flight is thus extremely important for insects, and it's thought to have developed during the Carboniferous. And interestingly, it was at least 50 million years before birds and reptiles appeared that could fly. And of course, also birds, as you probably know, and bats, their wings, their flight method rather, is an arm, but they're not with insects. So these wings early on were very simple. So they couldn't fold back, and they're very like our current dragonflies and mayflies, and they were much, much larger than today. That's a marvelous fossil of this extraordinary creature, which is very, very like a modern dragonfly. It isn't a modern one at all, but you can see the wings are out flat. That's because they couldn't bend them back, and that is like dragonflies are today. So all the fossils of those had these outstretched wings. And just to remind you again, so they were very early on. And we move into here, if we look at the plants, we have these strange things called cycads, and we had conifers. Now, these early plants are called gymnosperms, and that word simply means naked seed. And the ovule, which is the female bit that has to be fertilized, isn't contained within some kind of carpel. It's exposed on the surface of an organ. For example, this cycad, mysterious looking cone. And so it makes it easier because there's no tissue to be penetrated by the male part. So very simple. And the seeds in gymnosperms, these are the very first seed-bearing plants, ginkgo and conifers. Ginkgo is often called a living fossil because the same plant today was around many, many millions of years ago. Ginkgo, the pollen grain, which of course is the male, and on cycads, it produces a pair of flagellated mobile sperm cells, and they have to swim down the developing pollen tube to the female and eggs. And this is a lovely picture of a ginkgo. Absolutely beautiful trees. They were thought to have become extinct and were found in China, I think probably now about 150 years ago. And they date right back to the Permian, almost unchanged. These characteristic fan-shaped, very attractive leaves, Ginkgo biloba, a lovely plant. And here, the ginkgo seed, there is a female and a male, and it produces these little tiny plants, which then, of course, have to be fertilized. The sperm are really quite large. Fossil records, of course, for pollination, as you will imagine, are very rare, but there are some, and it looks very much as if there was pollination as early as the Triassic period. That's looking down inside a cycad. So there's cycads and conifers. As we move up through these periods, Triassic, you get the earliest mammals. When you come to the Jurassic, we start to see primitive plants, flowering plants rather. Conifers have also been around a very, very long time. They are adapted and they produce pollen, very like today's pollen. And the other advance here is that fertilization can occur without water. And that is a great advantage because before that, the plants had to be near water. They couldn't move because they weren't having anything that pollinated them. So therefore, they were restricted to where they grew. But here we now have seeds being produced, and this allows the embryo to be transported and developed elsewhere. And that enables these plants to move large distances. Going back to our insects and flight, by the late Jurassic Cretaceous, the wings that I mentioned before as being very simple become more complex, and they can now fold back, and all of those insects are called Neuroptera. And now I think currently something like 80 to 90% of insects belong to the Neuroptera. This gives them much more flexibility, and it allows the insect, for example, to hide in foliage and avoid predation, because by this period, the Jurassic, birds are around, and birds are amazing predators. So the majority of present insects do have this ability, so that they might be able to avoid predators. Birds and of course bats all fly on the wing and live off insects. And frequently this is regarded here as an example of what's called co-evolution. Some very successful insect groups evolved with flowering plants that we're just coming to during the Cretaceous period, moving up through these periods. And I'm sure you will guess what they are. Hymenoptera, of course, with bees and wasps and ants, butterflies and moths, or Lepidoptera, Diptera, or some Diptera had already evolved, but huge numbers of Diptera, and beetles, Coleoptera. These are all very successful insect groups, and they all exploded really during the Cretaceous. When we come to not gymnosperms, but angiosperms, these are plants that produce a seed within an enclosure. A very early example is magnolia. That's a very primitive angiosperm. They're fruiting plants technically, but we tend to refer to them commonly as flowering plants because the flower is something very obvious. Now, these are quite different from the gymnosperms. And when did they first appear? Well, the first ones known to exist are about 160 million years ago. And when we come to the lower Cretaceous, they diversified enormously and became really widespread around 120 million years ago. And they replaced conifers gradually as the dominant trees only actually 60 to 100 million years ago. Before that, the dominant species were conifers, but the flowering plants diversified so much that they now are the majority. This is again a fossil. Amber is a wonderful way of preserving things. And this is supposedly the oldest evidence of sexual reproduction in a flowering plant. We have to take the experts' opinion on this because they don't really look like anything, I think, to most of us. But these are little clusters of flowers. And this is from the Cretaceous again. This is the period when all the plants and insects diversified so much. And apparently, one of these is in the process of making new seeds. So this is an example of sexual reproduction. Not many records though, but the ones that there are, apparently these fossilized pollen grains show characteristics that are very similar to the pollen that's dispersed today. Also, in these fossils, the gut contents, wing structures, mouth parts of these beetles and flies, which were the earliest fossils, suggested that they were early pollinators. So fossils are extremely valuable. I mentioned magnolias. Magnolias are a very early plant and very primitive angiosperm. They have a very simple, undifferentiated flower, and they're pollinated particularly by bees and flies. Similarly, water lilies were also very similar. And that's just another lovely example of an insect in amber. This time it's a gnat, which is a Diptera, of course, flies. And it is beautiful. The details that can be seen are quite remarkable. And that does allow them to identify quite accurately what those insects did. And that's where they've been able to link them with pollination. Now I have a slight pause there. If there are any questions, that anybody wants to ask at this stage, please do. If not, they can wait till later. I'm not sure what the system is, Diane. If you have written...
There are no questions relating to your PowerPoint. There is someone who said, oh, someone's asked, what is undifferentiated?
Sorry?
What is undifferentiated?
Oh, right, from the simple flower. Well, as you move on through the flowers, they become much more complex. You have sepals and petals, for example, but the magnolias just have those simple things that look like petals, and the structure is very, very simple. But as they develop, the flowering plants become considerably more complex, as everything does. So we're moving on now to sex, of course. We can't avoid sex here. And the sexuality of plants is extremely important, and the contribution of insects to it. And Aristotle, I usually find some way of mentioning Aristotle, whatever talk I do, amazing man. And he recognized the value of insects long before other biologists did. And similarly, Theophrastus, he observed, with dates, it is helpful to bring the male to the female, for it's the male which causes the fruit to persist and ripen. We're very aware of this, but it wasn't aware, people weren't aware of it for a long, long time. In spite of them noting this so early, was ignored for a very, very long time. Not until the late 1600s, botanists began to realize that insects had a role to play, and pollen. And this amazing man, Christian Conrad Sprengel, he studied insects and plants in great detail. And he published in 1793 a wonderful book. The English title, The Secret of Nature, revealed in the structure and fertilization of flowers. Quite unheard of at that time. And this is the frontispiece of this beautiful book, obviously in German. If you look round the edge, you can recognize all sorts of flowers and insects, insect mouth parts. There's a viola down here and a hooded, what looks like a dead nettle sort of plant, and he was drawing attention to this. It seems odd that it took so long, but it did. What then is pollination and fertilization? This is very much a brief one, because I'm sure you will all know this, but the pollination itself is when you transfer pollen, which is the male part, onto the female part, the stigma. This beautiful picture comes from the book by Kessler and Hurley, and it's a cutaway of a primula. And down here is the ovary containing ovules that look all shiny and beautiful, a long style and a stigma, which often really looks sticky. So that's the female part. And the male, of course, are these. Here's the anther, which produces the pollen, and the pollen has, of course, to be transferred. That's gorgeous. Likewise, this is a lily, and here are the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 anthers, and there is the stigma. And fertilization is when the pollen grain tube grows all the way down the style, reaches the ovary, and then fuses with an ovule. That is fertilization. People sometimes get muddled between what is pollination and what's fertilization. In a way, they're similar, but not quite the same. Now, this is a lovely picture down the microscope from a wonderful new naturalist book by Procter & Yale, Pollination. It's a pollen grains of hellebores, and they are germinating in a sugary solution. You can do this yourself. You can collect pollen grains and try and germinate them. And it's wonderful to watch the pollen tube coming out of the outer layer of the pollen. And that beautiful picture is a pollen tube growing all the way down the style and masses of pollen grains. So that's the pollination, but here we're coming down towards the fertilization. What sorts of pollination are there? What means of? Wind, of course, is pretty common. Water, not in this country, but it is in some places. But a lot of pollination is from animals of varying kinds. We don't think of slugs and snails as pollinating, but they do. Bats, but again, not in this country. Birds, not in this country. Predominantly, of course, with us, it is insects, tremendously important. This is a lovely example of wind pollination. This is alder, an alder catkin, and shaking in the wind with these millions of pollen grains coming out. The snag with wind pollination, it does require a huge amount of pollen, and it's often in catkins, so they hang down and catch the wind. The pollen grains tend to be smaller, not always, but mostly they are smaller. They're often much smoother and very rarely sticky compared with insect pollinated plants. And it's only surprising always to me this, because there seem to be so many plants around that do produce catkins, but it's only about 10% of plants. Grasses, of course, a lot of conifers and some deciduous trees like alders and birches, but it's actually overall only about 10%. There's a lovely example of a snail, crawling up a rape flower. And in its process of munching, it will actually transfer pollen around. Birds are excellent pollinators. And notice that this flower is red. And that is a common theme with birds. Here he is, a hummingbird again on a red plant. And they're attracted by red. And those flowers are very rarely scented, because they have a very poor sense of smell. So quite a difference from the flowers that our bees are attracted to. And I love this. I took this in the Caribbean, and these little birds are called banana quets. They reminded me so much of blue tits, not in their appearance, but the way they all scuffle around and fight and scrabble over these. This is sugar they put out for them. And they are, of course, nevertheless, very good pollinators, mostly in the tropics. And this is a rather lovely example of another animal that's pollinating, although it's destroying as well. This is a little rock mouse, and it's a pagoda lily. So we have a slight break there if anybody wants to ask any questions about that.
There is one question, it does relate to the previous bit. To what extent did changes in atmospheric composition from the Devonian period affect plants and bee evolution? Would large insects correspond to greater oxygen levels?
Oh, clever. I thought somebody might ask why insects were so big at one stage when I mentioned the early dragonfly type insects, and they were huge. That has been put down to oxygen levels. I believe the oxygen levels then were over 30%, which is substantially more than now, which is 21%. The assumption is that because insects rely on spiracles and passive diffusion, the oxygen can get in much easier when there's a higher concentration of it, and also the temperature was considerably higher. So all of that led to those very, very big insects. But when the climate changed somewhat and the oxygen levels dropped, that made for difficulties because, of course, insects can't ever reach those sizes now. I didn't mention, but those big dragonfly-like creatures had a wingspan of about something like 27 inches, which is enormous. But that is why, or rather that's assumed why they could achieve those sizes. Okay, so now we're going to
Can we have a couple more questions? What did early insects eat if there were no flowering plants to them to feed on?
Well, I think they were just general munching. There were plants, they weren't flowering plants as we know them now, but there were plenty of things from an insect. Plus, many of them would have been predators anyway. They would themselves have been eating other insects. So it was quite a period of anything eating anything, really.
And then, do hummingbirds see the same range of colours as humans?
I believe not. But I don't really know much about that. They're certainly attracted by red, which is not so well seen by some insects, but I'm not sure how it compares with us. It's certainly very keen on red flowers, very much.
And then one question there, how does pollen get produced on the anther?
How does pollen get produced on the anther? Well, it starts off from a mass of germinal cells in tissues that are concentrated in the anther. I'm not quite sure quite what the question is asking there.
Right, well, should we leave that and you go on to the next bit? I think that's all the questions from the Q&A section for this bit. Thank you.
So now we're going to look at insects and what they do in terms of pollination. There's a huge range of insects. I think sometimes we're guilty of just thinking of bees. Beetles, I think, as I've mentioned, they were probably the earliest to evolve. And a number of beetles, of course, actually live on pollen. And Diptera, the flies, are very major pollinators, particularly the big group of hoverflies, but other flies as well, less attractive ones, should we say, but they're an enormous range there of pollination. The plants that produce pollen grains, as I've mentioned before with wind, they tend to be larger. This pollen grain is mallow. They look a little bit like landmines with these prickles all around the edge. And that is a particularly large pollen grain. Great range of them. That's rosebay willow herb, very beautiful, with sticky looking pores. And they have these uneven surfaces, either spines, like the one we've just seen, or sticky, like this. And that, of course, is so that they can stick together. That's just an example because I think it's a beautiful fly. It's a hoverfly, a cirripid fly. Many of them have these bright warning colorations. Very clever that, because they're mimicking things like wasps in the hope of not being eaten by a predator. This amazing little thing is called a bee fly. You can see why, because it looks like a bit like a bumblebee. The name Bombilius, bumblebees, some of the bumbles are bombus. It's got this very long proboscis, so it's developed for very long corolla. It isn't the sweet little thing it looks though, because it's quite an amazing predator. It lays eggs in solitary bee nests, but it's an excellent pollinator for the primula family and lady's smock, quite a lot of plants like that. You see it on the wing early in the year, in the spring. It's a delightful little thing when you see it. It hovers. and looks really lovely. Hummingbird hawk moth is another one with a very long proboscis that's developed. To see here, look, this wonderful long corolla and a proboscis going. Moths and butterflies, of course, can roll their proboscis up and then unroll it into a plant with a very long corolla. I've got a number of interesting mixes here of plants and insects. Midges and chocolate. I'm a chocoholic, so I found this really interesting. These two unpronounceable names of midges pollinate the cacao tree, which is the tree that produces cocoa, chocolate, which then, of course, enables the tree to produce fruit. But there are problems. I think they've actually solved these now, but there was a major problem in cocoa production, all down to mankind. So frequently we think we know best. And this is the tree, Theobroma cacao, and the flowers that come right out of the bark. They're quite delightful little things. And then when pollinated and fertilized, they produce these pods, which then ripen. And this is the cocoa pod, which of course is then turned into cocoa and chocolate. Now, the problem is that these midges are incredibly inefficient. They're very poor flyers. They can carry very little pollen if they go from flower to flower. And even worse, each flower typically only lasts 24 to 48 hours. Now, that isn't really very long. So it's got to pollinate in that time when the flower is out with these poor little midges that don't fly very far and don't carry much pollen. Now, sorry, just go back. That didn't matter until man interfered, because the tree lives on the edge of jungle forest in moist areas where the midges are. Well, mankind thought it's not really very efficient. What we're going to do is plant great rows of them. I'll just go back, so that we can harvest these pods more efficiently with lots of lovely machinery. So they did that, planted them in rows so that they could collect those pods. But unfortunately, the midges, of course, couldn't get that far along. So their actual amount they got less and less, because basically they hadn't looked into the life cycle of what was pollinating it. So they had to readjust what they were doing. There's a moral there, and quite frequently it's not remembered. Then we've got some extraordinarily odd plants that do strange things. First of all, they're tempting a pollinator in, but aren't actually offering them much in the way of a reward. This is the famous voodoo lily, which emits an odor that's likened to rotting flesh. It's apparently disgusting. And of course, it attracts flies. We all know that flies love meat that's going off. The only equivalent we have are the arums, cuckoo pint, or lords and ladies. Most attractive plant. You have to get quite close to it to smell it, and it isn't really terribly nice. And when this is it cut away so that you can see the inside, but the scent, it isn't very nice, and it does attract a lot of small flies. And it's producing a hormone which produces heat, and that volatilizes the scent. See these bits sticking down like this? So the fly can push its way by, but it can't get back up. So it gets trapped, and it gets trapped there, and it's able to get down into this lower chamber. And this is an example of what's called protogyny. So the stigma, which is the female bit, is recepted first, and then later pollen is produced, This is the stigma and those are the stamens. And pollen is produced so that it can pollinate it. And then these top bristles do decay. And so the flies that haven't actually died are able to be released. It's an extraordinarily complex mechanism. And one does wonder how on earth that evolved. And then, of course, we've got the wonderful bee orchid, so called because it really does look like a bumblebee. It's really most attractive. That's close up. Now, bumblebees can only assume that they must actually be rather dumb because they try to mate with it. Unsuccessfully, clearly, but in the process of trying to mate with it, orchids produce things called pollinia. They're large lumps of pollen. And of course, the bumblebee does carry it to another flower, so it results in pollinating it. But I can never quite understand why a bee should think that it can mate with that. Hellebores are also related to orchids. This is a native of ours, the broad-leaved helleboran, and this relies on wasps, Vespula, both vulgaris and germanica, for their pollination services. Now, wasps also quite like not terribly pleasant smells, and apparently this orchid is releasing a chemical cocktail that smells like a caterpillar infestation. So the wasps, and as we know, wasps are incredibly good predators, they think there's going to be caterpillars on this plant. And in the process of hunting for the caterpillars, they actually do pollinate the hellebore. Then we've got moths and yucca. This pretty little moth, it's a little yucca moth, and that pollinates the flowers of the yucca plant. And the female yucca lays her, female yucca moth, she lays her eggs right inside the chambers of the flower. And there, that's detail of the flower, which is very attractive, it really is. And there's this pretty little moth. So she then collects pollen from the anthers, forms it into a ball, and pushes it right down the flower's stigma. Sounds jolly hard work, which then means, of course, that the flower can now produce seeds, but just in time for the yucca moth larva to hatch and feed on them. So for the yucca to get successfully fertilized, it's a balance in time as to how many of the moth larvae hatch and eat the flower. There's quite a lot of complex ones like this. I thought that was one of the nicest, though. Ants also play their part. Formica argentea worker ants, they carry pollen grains between a cascade knotweed. And there's quite a lot of Formica ants distribute pollen. One is an elf orpine, a compact herb that grows on granite outcrops, and it's carrying them backwards and forwards. And I believe they're thought to distribute cyclamen seeds as well. So they're quite useful. Darwin's orchid, one has to mention Darwin's orchid, also known as Star of Bethlehem orchid or Christmas orchid. Extraordinary plant. And if you look at this great long corolla, there's a better picture of that in a moment, this piece there. Now, Darwin, he observed this orchid and he was learning, as many people were at that time, of the interaction of insects and plants. He predicted that there would be an insect with a very long proboscis that would be the pollinator. But people did not agree with him. And I find this so sad. My hero is Darwin, or one of them. He did not discover in his lifetime that this was true. And here is a better picture showing you the length of it. Just look at this. So you can see why people might have said, that's a bit far-fetched. You couldn't possibly get an insect with a proboscis that long. But there is. It took 21 years after his death when this hawk moth was discovered, and it has a foot-long proboscis. And that's a picture of it. Just look. It is extraordinary. And that was not discovered, sadly, till after Darwin was dead. So he never knew that he was going to be proved right. I find that very sad. So there's a pause there if anybody has any questions. Have they all died?
No, but Rinka has answered the pollen question. That was asked.
Good.
Pollen is produced from so-called pollen mother cells in an anther. These cells undergo meiosis, reduction or division. The result is a cell with just one copy of each chromosome instead of two. The same process happens in us when we produce sperm cells or egg cells. It's a bit more complex, but he hopes this answers Gareth's question. So thank you, Rinka, for that.
Thank you, Rinka. I had a horrible feeling you were in the audience. Rinka is a true expert, folks.
So I don't think there are any more questions. Let me just look in the chat window. I don't think anyone's put anything in there. Right, I think you're free to carry on.
Okay, so our last section then is looking at bees as pollinators. And don't forget, we're talking about all bees here. So many different kinds of bees. But since we're talking about evolution, let's go back to how did they evolve? It's generally thought that they evolved from parasitic wasps, probably from a group called Asphecidae. And it's believed that the wasps would gradually collect pollen because it's very nutritious, and also, of course, nectar, which is very sweet. And thus, they may have gradually realized that this was a jolly nice method of feeding and could have stopped becoming being parasites. There is some fossil evidence for this. This is a 100 million year old fossil, and it apparently has characteristics of wasps and bees, but more bee characteristics than wasps. So it's possible that that's true. That's a lovely fossil as well, also 100 million years old. And this actually has beetle larvae on its surface. And they have been able, this is Amber again, they've actually been able to look at the larvae on its surface. So the indications are that that is where they came from. Now, coming up far more recently, this is a stingless bee, a mere 10 to 15 million years old. And this has orchid pollinia on it, which is fascinating. Pollinia with these large clusters of pollen. So there are fossil records, but they are few and far between. So what are the characteristics then? Well, all bees, whatever kind of bees we're talking about, they are a group of insects that developed hairiness quite quickly. And of course, those hairs are extremely valuable. A lot of species have these specialized legs, like honeybees and some of the bumblebees, that allows them specifically to collect pollen and push them together. A big point with bees is that they do not damage the plant. Many of these other insects, wonderful though they are, and all these amazing adaptations, they are very damaging. Some butterflies, beautiful things, but their larvae, of course, the caterpillars, hugely damaging. And strange things like the yucca moth, but bees don't. Now that's just to forestall somebody saying, oh, but what about the leafcutter bee? But the leafcutter bee, this is a very minor thing. Wonderful, she is cutting a circle out to go and furnish her nest. It's a lovely example too of the hairs, lots and lots of hairs all over the body. And of course, pollen collects. This is a picture I got from Juliet many years ago of a bombus close up. Isn't that beautiful? I think she said if he's got a yellow face, it's a male. Why do we claim that honeybees are particularly good? Because bumblebees and solitary bees are also very good pollinators, sometimes of very specific plants or crops. But honeybees do have various advantages that we make great play of. One is this extraordinary characteristic called flower constancy or fidelity. The colonies of a honeybee are much larger in the spring. This is in terms of crops early on, much more so than before bumblebees or solitary bee numbers have increased sufficiently. Now that means, of course, you can move a colony to a crop, apple orchard or rape or something like that. It can be moved and give you a really big foraging force. Good old Aristotle again. He observed, is there anything this man didn't observe? The bee does not fly from a flower of one kind to a flower of another, but flies from one violet, say, to another violet, and never meddles with another flower until it has got back to the hive, which is what we call flower constancy. The point of that is that it leads to very good pollination and thus eventually fertilization. Now, somebody else observed that. This was an Arthur Dobbs. He was a gardener from County Antrim back in 1750. These people were so observant, and that, of course, is the secret of good biology. Upon whatsoever flower I saw it first alight and gather the farina, that's pollen, it continued gathering from that kind of flower and has passed over many other species, though very numerous, without alighting upon or loading from them. And he then went on to say, I think that Providence has appointed the bee to be very instrumental in promoting the increase of vegetables, as the abundant farina often covers the whole bee, as well as what it loads upon its legs. It carries the farina from flower to flower by its walking upon the pistillum. So he was obviously watching very carefully indeed. And what he observed, of course, is absolutely true. They often land up completely covered in pollen, as well as what they are loading in its legs. And then it comes to another flower, and what's on its back, it goes to the other flower. So how is the bee adapted then for pollination? This is just a rather lovely drawing of the hind leg. This is the corbicula, which is where the pollen gets pushed into with an inner face. This is the wonderful pollen press, and it really looks like a rake there, a rack. These combs in lines on the lower part. And when it flexes that, of course, it pushes the pollen into the corbicula. This is actually down the microscope. Here is the pollen press. And there you can see how it can press that together and compress the pollen. And there you can see the lines of bristles along there. So a very clever adaptation. And an even cleverer one, I think, is the antenna planer on the front leg. The best way I've always found of seeing this is in something like a poppy, a lovely big open flower that they love, and burrow around collecting pollen, and then they sit on the edge of the flower and they draw their antennae through here. And what they're doing is cleaning the pollen off the antenna, because if the antenna is bunged up with a whole load of pollen grains, it will impair it flying back to the hive. So that is such a clever adaptation. And again, of course, just look, hairs everywhere, short ones, long ones, thin ones, fat ones. And just to finish with some lovely examples of close-ups of bees showing all these hairs, even on the eyes, they have got hairs everywhere. That's a beautiful one too. Just look, hairs, 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 absolutely everywhere. And a lovely picture from Jerry Collins, who takes the most stunning photographs of the corbicula, absolutely full of pollen from a marsh marigold, a glorious colour. Plus, of course, pollen all over it as well. So not only is it carrying pollen back to the hive, it's carrying pollen to the next flower it visits. And these are two beautiful pictures from Touts. That superb one, pollen all over it, and there it's pushing its proboscis down into a tubular flower. And again, you can see the mass and mass of hairs. And I think I've been going on long enough. That should be the end. That's Karen Alton's lovely picture of a bee flying towards a dandelion. They love dandelions. Do remember that when you try and get rid of them in the garden. Dandelions are such good feed, not just for bees, but for all sorts of insects. And another lovely one from Touts, pollen everywhere. So thank you very much for your attention. Hope I haven't sent too many of you to sleep. Another lovely picture there of pollen. So thank you. Sorry, let's press escape.
Yes, there's one question. I've just got to find the question sheet now. Let me get to it. What prompted the appearance of hair in the evolution of bees?
Gosh, I honestly don't know. A bit like, how do any of these things develop? Something starts and it is of value. And if it's of value, as with most evolution, if something is of value, it will persist and develop further, is the only thing I can think of. Have we got any clever people in the audience who've got a better idea? But
go on. How do they know the age of remains found in the amber and other fossils? The
age of what?
The remains found in amber and other fossils.
Oh, well, it's usually from the geological layers that they're in, and it does lead to quite a lot of dissension. One of my favourite insect books that I've had for a very, very long time, it's American, 60s, I think. He actually has a table, which is rather good, of the first appearance according to, and he has 4 different authors ranging from the early 1900s through to the 40s, 50s, and they vary quite substantially. And some of them, he actually says it's because subsequently they had misunderstood the layers they were in. which is inevitable because it is quite complicated, but all of geology and fossils are down to where they find them. And sometimes, of course, they can make mistakes. And for example, in some of those examples, they claimed coleoptera beetles were first evolved way before other people said they were. Gradually, they get refined and they're always changing their minds. And you will find yet another fossil comes along and it will push back even earlier, perhaps because they'll find it in an earlier layer. Because remember, we're talking about very tiny things here. Likewise with the plants, actually, it's quite difficult to find really good fossils. The problem is paleontology is so dominated by dinosaurs and great big animal bones, because tiny animals of any kind are rare or are difficult to find. It's not so much that they're rare, they're probably very common, but they're really difficult to find. So it depends hugely on where they find them and whether they've been disturbed. If you see pictures of paleontologists, they're sitting there painstakingly picking out, just like archaeologists are, looking very carefully at the layers and making sure it is a genuine rock of that era and not another one.
Excellent. Barry's asked, are there any night flying bees or wasps?
Sorry, can you, I've got a problem with my ears at the moment, folks. I'm not hearing. Can you say it again, Diane?
Are there any night flying bees or wasps?
Oh, wasps fly at night. Have you ever tried extracting at night? Oh, really bad news. You think you're going to be safe and they do fly at night. But I don't think there are bees that fly at night. Anybody know any different? I don't think wasps actually hunt at night, but they're very intelligent creatures. So if you're extracting, they smell your honey. I've heard stories of people who've tried extracting in their, swimming trunks and discovering it's bad news that the wasps still come in. But I don't think bees do, because basically bees are looking for flowers, aren't they? And a lot of it is visual cues. So they're looking for those lovely coloured, scented of course. Obviously moths and so forth do, and many of the plants that they go to are scented beautifully at night. But I think probably not for bees.
And I think that's one of the differences between the Asian hornet and the European hornet, isn't it? The European one flies at night, I think.
Yes.
So that's one of the question our AHAT team people can use to ask is, if it's flying at night, it's not an Asian hornet. It's
probably ours. Yes.
Yes. I'm just having a quick look through the rest. This one's a little controversial perhaps, but there has been talk that there are too many honeybees in the urban environment, which is depleting the amount of pollen available to other pollinators. Your opinion, please, Pam.
Well, I know I'm not popular for saying this, but I agree. I'm going to try and write something about it, but I don't think we can stick our head in the sand just because we love our honeybees. I think we all have to be very careful, not just urban environment, anywhere, because forage is at a premium and we need to be aware not just of other bees, but of other pollinators, all those marvelous hoverflies and butterflies. There's just so many pollinators. And insects struggle. All things are struggling nowadays. We've got a pretty dreadful world, really. We destroy it all the time, don't we? And it disturbs me when people try to have too many colonies. I know from friends I know in London that they have said for some years, as this mania for hives on roofs and so forth, their yields of honey were going down. I don't personally believe that yields of honey should be the be all and end all of beekeeping. I think you should keep bees for other reasons. But nevertheless, if people overload an area, it's incredibly difficult to provide sufficient forage for lots and lots of colonies of bees. There are all sorts of things you can do to help. And Rinker's in the audience, he's one of our researchers, and he is has done some lovely work where they've put big planters in the centre of Newcastle. And that's lovely, and it's a wonderful experiment to look at what insects and how it's attracted insects, but no one could pretend that that could actually provide forage for huge numbers of colonies. But I do think it is unwise, I really do. I gather it varies very much in cities. There are some places where there aren't many, but I get a feeling there's an awful lot of companies think it's good to be green, and green means, oh, let's have a few honeybee colonies. And if they're put in the wrong places and there are too many of them, it's going to give beekeepers a bad name. So I must admit, as I'm, say, manager of research and technical environmental, have lots of youngsters writing in, wildly enthusiastic. They've discovered the environment. What can I do? And I want to have a colony of bees. I try to say to them, tell you what would be much better. Don't use any chemicals. Tell all your neighbours not to use any chemicals. Forget spraying aphids on roses, and grow lots and lots of lovely different kinds of flowers around the year, and you will do a lot more good for bees and the environment than trying to become a beekeeper. But I don't think everybody agrees with me.
And going back to what we were chatting about right at the beginning before the presentation, plant some trees, plant bee-friendly trees perhaps, because it is said, and I don't know how true it is, but a mature tree is equivalent to about an acre.
Yeah, can be. The trouble is, you can't always plant trees. My favourite always for people with small gardens is a crabapple, every time, because it never gets absolutely huge. But not everyone's got the space all the time. It takes ages for them to grow. And the saddest thing of all is, yes, trees are going to be wonderful, aren't they? And then they produce those great big things called leaves. And people complain because the leaves are untidy and they don't like them. Was it Sheffield where they were going to cut thousands of trees down a while ago? And you think that is so sad. It really is. But yes, trees are wonderful, a big range of trees. But there's lots of shrubs that can be planted in areas that aren't big enough perhaps for trees. But even people with just window boxes, you know, you can plant a wonderful range of bulbs for the early part of the year, and stop having such tidy gardens and stop cutting your lawns all the time. So there's lots of things that can be done and should be done, really.
Yes. Somebody did ask, what sort of lime is it that bees like? It's a tilia, I think, isn't it? But I don't know what particular one.
Well, a couple of them can produce substances that certainly will kill bumblebees. Honeybees are less susceptible, and there are big arguments as to quite what it is, whether it is the production of maltose, which they can't digest effectively. And bumblebees in particular, it is reversible, but so slowly reversible that it latches on to the enzyme and they effectively cannot produce any energy or fly. And you see, again, limes, they're absolutely wonderful, but people complain about them bitterly in places because of the honeydew. They don't like their lovely cars damaged by honeydew. So it really is difficult. It's like the people that say they really love bees and then ring you up and say, I've got these bees, and often turns out to be tree bumblebee, you know, in a bird box, and it's in the way, and it's right where I need to go to my washing or whatever. Can you do something about it? So it is difficult, very difficult.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Pam. There is one more question. It's back quite early on in your PowerPoint. Where in time do insectivorous plants come from? How do they fit in with pollination?
Ooh,
And
gosh, that's a really interesting one, which I don't know. Is Rinka still there? Rinka might know. That's a really interesting one, where indeed, I'm trying to think what family they're in. So, but I don't know. I'd have to check. Anybody else out there know? Yeah, Mr.
right, he's saying that carnivorous plants are in different families.
Yeah. Oh, so they're not all the same. Oh no, of course they're not, because butterwort's quite different from other things, isn't it? Yes, they're very diverse, aren't they? Saracenas and butterworts, and no, intriguing. I don't know at all.
That could be a whole talk on its own.
Absolutely. I shall have to go away and find out.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Pam. I have read lots and lots of lovely messages saying thank you to you for this evening's talk. I hope we've answered everyone's questions for them. There will be another talk coming very soon. And so watch our social media for that. If you don't follow us on Facebook, then please do. And we're on Twitter as well. So please follow us on social media to find out when the next talk will be. Thank you all very much for coming this evening. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. Thank you very much, Pam. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. I shall say good night, everyone. Good night.
Good night.